We are so privileged to have so many European superpowers come to our little town and put on such a show. And in the end, it's Sidnev and DanV in the finals. So without further ado, the finals, game number 1 in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Tetris! You can see there, same piece. It's always interesting to see if the players, when the players deviate, and they almost immediately deviated with their opening sequences. Sidnev obviously with their signature one push down point. Sidnev able to get the first Tetris. Dan still with some delayed burns over to the right side that he's gonna have to deal with before he can start getting the Tetrises. Dan here, bit of a suffer start. Not really what you want. Yet to score a Tetris after 14 lines. Has reopened the well. Is Tetris ready? Just needs a bar, but is forced to build another. Delayed burn, of course. Bar shows up, but thankfully there's a bar for Dan's first Tetris. Sidnev, however, getting off to a flawless start. 117 for Sidnev. 39,000 for Dan. $66,000 here for Dan, 144 for Sidnev. And Dan's left side not looking good. Right now, Code Red isn't ringing just yet here for Dan. But it's more burning when he really would rather not. It's already a over 100,000 point lead here in game number 1 of the finals for Sidnev. Sidnev just getting off to a solid start. Dan having a bit of a suffer start. It looks like Dan is slowly finding his rhythm here in the finals. 120,000 for Dan, 239,000 for Sidnev. Oh, Dan here with a hang. Does have an open Tetris well, but that does not burn, so now has to deal with the situation from the top. Needs an L or J yesterday. Dan in trouble. Needs something for the left side. Gets the bar over. But this is still so dangerous. So volatile. Anything can still happen, but Dan somehow navigating his way through absolute misery. And still surviving, but those square pieces are not what he needs, and Dan needs a square for the left side. Gets the bar, gets a Z piece, and now all of a sudden has burnt it down to a height that surely you think he can definitely survive. Now, this is still so tough. 198 for Dan. Sidnev just having a solid game at 339. It's not a world-breaking pace, but Dan surviving a huge scare in the finals. This has not been the start into the finals that Dan wanted, but he lives to fight, which is the most important thing. $279,000 for Dan, $395 for Sidnev. Dan getting Lombard dependency filled over to the left side. Dan's high burning has also resulted in a 12-line discrepancy in favor of Sidnev. So Sidnev is not only ahead by 160,000 points, also got 8 lines in hand. Dan's got a clean board and is just ready to go for it. 331 for Dan into level 19. Sidnev still with 2 more Tetrises available on 18. Gets 1. 509 for Sidnev. Tetris for Dan at 356. Dan here with another Tetris. At the very least, it was not the start that Dan hoped for into a final, but is slowly starting to find his groove. So whatever happens, if Dan can just get comfortable, maybe that's the best he can hope for at this point, but by no means has he given up on this game. Still lots and lots of lines to go. 489 for Dan, 610,000 for Sidnev. Sidnev with a misdrop. Gonna end up with a few holes, gets a Tetris. Knowing Sidnev, they're gonna solve this like it's absolutely nothing. And SPs was not what they were looking for. But able to tuck in the bar. It's looking better already, but definitely gonna need to at least burn one more line. And that's probably the best solve you could have hoped for. Sidnev now with a clean board at 648. Still on level 22. Dan on level 23 at 582. So Dan has been Tetrising here on post-transition. Absolutely. But unfortunately for him, Sidnev hasn't really let off the gas. $676 here for Dan. Tetris for Dan goes up to 707, is 14 lines ahead and behind by 90,000 points. But Dan has done a fantastic job just in trying to stay alive here in this game. And there's still the little thing known as post 29, which may just throw some wrenches here in the works. Sidnev though with the Tetris goes up to 886. Still on level 25. Dan at 774. Dan looking at a high 900k, really at best. While Sidnev is definitely looking at a comfy 1.1 before level 29. So it's all the indicators are pointing towards a DanV masterclass needed on 29 for game number 1 to still be competitive. And here we go. Dan into level 29 at 949. Sidnev still on level 28 at A63. So he's nearly 100,000 points ahead with still a couple more Tetrises to go. Oh my god, Dan with a tuck is set up for the Tetris, is going aggressive, knows he needs to. Does get the Tetris, but did sacrifice a lot of board health for it. Still survivable here for Dan. Needs to get the bar over, doesn't get the bar over. And Dan is going to be done at A12. It was a great fight. After the start that Dan had to even stay in it, it was very, very difficult to stay in it. But either way, Sidnev just keeping it cool, keeping the lead, and taking game number 1 of the finals. Ready? All right. Game number 2. In 3, 2, 1. Tetris. Dan just had such of a nightmare start as he won. And they've both gone for the same setup here. Oh my Christ. So it's actually Dan who got the square and was able to tuck it in. But somehow Dan's ended up with a worse board than Sidnev. Both players with a Tetris, but Sidnev able to get their second while Dan is still in danger. It's not huge danger. They've survived worse than this in the last game. L-piece is crucial there. But when you're at a height like this, even if you are rolling, bad sequence, a missed roll, still you're so close. You're still flirting with death, no matter how fast you can move pieces at that height. But Dan able to survive for now. Currently at 45,000, has quite a few holes, and even if they're able to get another bar over to the right well, it still won't be a Tetris. So after the great post-transition Dan had, the goal was definitely try and not let Sidnev get such a big lead. But right now, it's looking easier said than done, as Sidnev is not having a record-breaking start to this game by any means, but just having a very solid start, while Dan is dirty, does get a dirty Tetris, up to 88,000. Sidnev at 173. Oh. Dan currently at 94,000, Sidnev at 243. Dan with a very high double well. Needs to take a skim. Takes a skim into a Tetris. 142 for Dan, 289 for Sidnev. So it's once again a suffer start here for Dan. Somehow, some way, Dan still managed to make the last game interesting despite having such a tough start. But that's not something you can rely on. It's not like Dan is a stranger to having his back against the wall. One of the matches I remember most from going to Portland, going to CTWC live last October, was Dan taking on Alice in the first round or round 0. It was the first match that Dan played. Dan was having a very, very rough time, and all of a sudden was facing the prospect of losing to a DAS player. Somehow, some way, pulled himself back and got himself over the line. However, the opponent that Dan is facing today is Sidnev, who, as mentioned before on the stream, is unequivocally one of the best players in the world, and is even has a very strong case nowadays for being the very best in the world. Currently 481 for Sidnev, 372 for Dan. So over 100,000 point lead here for Sidnev. Nice adjustment there. It's one of those adjustments where you can just tell the player clearly just thinks what's the best move. It's very good to see. That just there for Dan goes up to 418. Sidnev at 550. Dan at 463. Sidnev at 596. And Dan has transitioned to level 19 at 472 now in level 19. Sidnev at 602, also on 19 now. Dan really wanted an L piece. Had to create 2 holes at different altitudes. But able to uncover the first one. And with 2 singles, able to solve the other one. Sidnev now hanging a bar. So taking a couple of skims, gets the L piece all the way over upright, and gets the next bar over, so ending up not being too much of a scare there for Sidnev, although this is going to cost them a couple of burns, and Dan does have a clean board. So if there was ever a time to rack up some points for Dan, the time is now. Sidnev has now cleaned out of it. Dan does get a Tetris. So, has cut down the lead to about 80,000 points at the same line count. Which, when you're playing against Sidnev, you'll absolutely take anything when you're behind. 625 for Dan, 736 for Sidnev. Oh, Sidnev, what's a series of misdrops. So now, once again, the opportunity for Dan. Dan not quite Tetris ready right now. But does still have a clean board. Gets a Tetris right there while Sidnev's board. Looks like it's not going to be a simple solve. As I say that, Sidnev still with a dirty board, but able to at least get 1 Tetris to burn down. And Dan, meanwhile, keeping a clean board, gets a Tetris, goes up to 724 into level 25. And Sidnev is nearly clean, but still has a bit to burn out of. But that was a perfect transition over to the right well. That dig worked out like as well as he could have hoped. Sidnev is the type of player to make a mess look like a symphony. Tetris there for Dan goes up to 807. Sidnev at 877. Both players on level 26. Dan gonna enter level 27, still behind. It's looking like he's gonna be able to enter 29 with less of a deficit than the last game. But being behind Sidnev in any situation is never a good thing. As I say that, Sidnev hanging an L piece, able to tuck in a bar and gets the Vits there. Does cost them a couple of burns. Dan currently, with 1 more Tetris available, needs an L piece. Definitely, at the very least, needs a clean board here before 29. And so Dan, not with a clean board, but has tried to clean it up as much as he can to try and get the dig done here on 27, but some dead drops there for Dan are going to do it. And Sidnev, once again, it was a furious fight back there from Dan, but Sidnev keeping their cool, keeping up the pace, and able to just be too solid for Dan. And now, 2-0 up, and 1 game away. All right, ready? All right, game number 3. Match point here for Sidnev. Championship point for Sidnev. Game number 3 in 3, 2, 1. Tetris. Dan here. Memory serves correct. In the last CTUK finals, was actually down 2-0 to SV. And was able to turn it around. Dan certainly not shy of the big moments, although that was almost definitely a misdrop. But it actually ends up just working out perfectly fine. So far, both players with just 1 burnt line. Ooh. That is some... Those are some very good decisions there from Dan. It's not like the board looks amazing, but looking at the pieces and considering what could have happened, Dan really did handle them very well. 139 apiece here for both players. Dan needing to at least burn off a single if he's able to get a bar. Otherwise, burn a double there with a T-piece. Oh, Dan there. Maybe was a little bit hesitant. By the way, not where he wanted to place that piece. Oh, Dan is gonna get away with it there with another long bar. So far, Sidnev with a minor lead, but Dan doing a better job here in this game of at least keeping up early on here with Sidnev. 211 for Sidnev, 172 for Dan. Is Marq, if you mean Marq Meyer? Yes, he was at the event. Marq went out to, I think it was Dan? Wait, the bracket's right there. No, Marq went out to SV. It was SV. They're both British and they both have V's in their name, so. And they also look like each other. 329 for Sidnev, 308 for Dan. Dan keeping it within one Tetris there, but bit unlucky timing there with the bar, but able to utilize the next one. Nice adjustment there for the bar. 334 for Dan, 375 for Sidnev. .405 for Dan, 443 for Sidnev. Manta, where is he? Thank you for the sub, for the Prime sub. Subscribe for 2 months. How kind of you. $4.98 for Dan, $5.15 for Sidnev. Sidnev once again having a lead here on the 18 portion of the game. Very mistimed square there for Dan. Not what he wanted whatsoever. Heps! Thank you for the sub. $5.34. Dan currently building on row 2. Sidnev at $5.84. Will there be any exhibition? I mean, well, I guess we're not just going to end the stream immediately, but no, nothing like that. Nothing like that is planned. We're already a little bit over schedule anyways. Sidnev here really bringing the heat. One Tetris away from a 670 transition. Meanwhile, Dan has transitioned to level 19 at 580 and is going to have to use up his first few lines of post-transition with some burning. Although, does decide to set up for the center well, gets the Tetris, and does decide to take the 2 singles to bring it back over to the right side. Dan on level 20 at 611. Sidnev with a Tetris into level 20 at 706. So it's about a 100k lead here for Sidnev, but I mean, dealing with players as good as this, leads like that are by no means a death sentence if you are on the receiving end. However, Dan here Nice roof burn there after a nasty misdrop. Oh, Dan, though, is turning into a bit more of a mess than you would have hoped for. Sidnev getting away with the Vits. Although then again, Sidnev running into some issues. Sidnev now ahead by 130,000 points, but Dan able to clean up his board faster than his opponent. Another Tetris 4. Dan goes up to 718. Sidnev going aggressive here. Was set up there for the row 3, column 2 Tetris. 803 now for Sidnev. 747 for Dan. Sidnev once again set up for the Tetris. Does get the dirty Tetris this time, but still has a couple of lines of burning ahead of them. And just like that, Dan is so close now in score, but unfortunately, just as they were approaching, had a nasty misdrop there. Dan fighting for his life. Sidnev, meanwhile, is clean and looking to reestablish a solid lead here, as Dan, T-piece was what he was hoping for. Pieces he got do work. 826 for Dan. Sidnev at 931. So despite Dan's best efforts, it is looking like deja vu here. Looking like Dan's gonna have to pull off something on 29 in order to stay alive here in the tournament. Sidnev looking to close the book, bring home another title for the Netherlands. Sidnev at A73, Dan 170,000 points behind. Gets a Tetris, goes up to 942. Dan there with the Tetris, goes up to 980. Sidnev, though, into level 28 at 1.1. Tetris for Dan into 29. Gets a Tetris immediately on 29, goes up to A54. Sidnev still with one more Tetris to go into level 29 at B82. So over 100,000 points now, the lead here for Sidnev. Dan, though, gets another Tetris. Not going down without a fight. B30 here for Dan, set up for another Tetris, but is sacrificing the board. Gets a Tetris, goes up to B68. Less than a Tetris behind now, but in terms of board states, Sidnev definitely with the advantage, but Dan is still going here. Sidnev, though, looking to reply with a Tetris of their own. Gets the Tetris. C46 here for Sidnev, piling on the misery here for Dan, but Dan is slowly burning this out at B90. Sidnev at C53. Dan is doing well here to burn it out, but Sidnev there with the first 1.3 of the day. Oh, Dan misses 2 bars and goes down on his shield. Absolutely delivering here, but in the end, Sidnev closing it out with a 1.3. Choke artist? I don't think so. Mentality monster to pull off a 1.3 to close out the tournament. And your CTWC Austria 2023 winner is Sidnev.